I was once introduced by the conservative philosopher Roger Scruton, who has recently been in the news, and he said, Timothy Garton Ash is, of course, a Balliol man, referring to that college which famously produced left-wing intellectuals and politicians. And I said, no, I wasn't at Balliol, I was at Exeter College. And without missing a beat, Scruton said, objectively, you are a Balliol man. So, if you look at Tim Snyder's CV, you will see that, according to the text, he studied at Balliol College, Oxford, but objectively, he's a St. Anthony's man. And there's a little more basis for that claim than there was in the Scruton case, because Timothy Snyder was our student in the early 1990s in a wonderful seminar in the immediate afterglow of 1989, which you will well remember, an amazing group of people, including Ivan Krastev. I then had the great pleasure of supervising his doctoral dissertation on Kazimierz Keles-Krauss, together with a great Polish scholar, Jerzy Jedlicki, and we're very proud of what he's done since, which is, in the first place, to become, over a period of about 20 years, probably the leading historian of Central and Eastern Europe in his generation, culminating in the book, which you will all know, Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, which catapulted his work into a wider public debate in a very important way, and I think has become an absolute reference point for both historical and political discussion. And then catalyzed, I think it's fair to say, by the advent of Donald Trump, he stepped more into a public intellectual role with a small best-selling book called On Tyranny, his most recent book called The Road to Unfreedom, and he's currently working on what sounds like a fascinating book on the future of freedom, apropos Ralph Dahrendorf and his work. But for this evening, we have tempted him back to European history as it relates to today. Please join me in welcoming this year's Dahrendorf Lecture.
So it's an ambiguous pleasure at best to begin by agreeing with the person who introduces you. There is something to the claim that objectively I am a student of St. Anthony's. As I was listening to the recollections last night, it was all too obvious what I would have talked about, because I spent my early 20s in this place, or rather, this was the place from which I escaped to Poland and Ukraine and the Baltics and Czechoslovakia and the other places that I really wanted to go. Which means that I was a student here when Ralph Dahrendorf was warden. And I appreciated this at the time as much as anyone in their early 20s, fresh from the United States, can appreciate it. In retrospect, and with a bit of age, I now appreciate much more just how difficult it is to unify a life in politics, public policy, academic institutions, and above all, intellectual life, as Ralph Dahrendorf did. I'd like to begin this lecture, though, from a moment of my not understanding Ralph Dahrendorf. So both of my initial tutors are in this room. Tim Garton-Ash supervised my dissertation. My moral tutor, as it was then called, and I hope still is, Martin Conway, is also here. And so they will remember a young American coming to Europe for the first time. Americans coming to Europe for the first time face certain interpretive difficulties. One of them has to do with senses of humor. So in general, it's the case that we think the British are joking when they're not. And with the Germans, it's the other way around. Which means that when confronted with the august figure of Ralph Dahrendorf, I faced a special kind of interpretive problem. Because here you had a man who was both at the same time. So a quarter of a century ago, I was in this room, but I was occupying not this role, but rather the role of the students. I was a paid assistant organizing a conference, or helping to organize a conference, on a very similar topic. And Ralph Dahrendorf was running around him as well, looking after the various East Europeans who had come with their luggage and so on. And there was a problem with the East Europeans and their luggage. In particular, one Romanian had lost his suitcase. And Ralph Dahrendorf said to me, let's establish a principle. Everyone should be responsible for his own luggage. I could not tell if he was joking or not. Was this a sincere Kantianism extending down to the smallest aspects of life? Was this a moment of exuberant overconfidence about our ability in the West to project our values to our neighboring country to the East? I wasn't sure at the time, and honestly, I'm still not sure, but I'm thinking about it 25 years on. Ralph Dahrendorf was not only the director of the LSE. As many of you will know, he wrote a biography of the LSE. It's very characteristic of him to both do something and reflect upon it. At the beginning of one of the chapters of this biography, is this microphone working at all, or am I just, it is okay. At the beginning of one of the chapters of his biography of the LSE, there's a passage where, again, I'm not sure, but I think it's supposed to be funny. You can help me. The chapter is about the 60s in the LSE. And I think much of what we're talking about is actually a kind of return to the late 1960s, or as I experience it anyway, as the next generation, a kind of last hurrah of the debates of the 1960s. In any event, Dahrendorf begins this chapter by describing the annual reports of the director of the LSE. And the text runs like this. Annual report of 1960 to 1961. This has not been a year of great changes. 1959 to 1960. This year saw no major developments or important changes. 1958 to 1959. This year saw development on lines already established. 1957 to 1958. This year witnessed no major new developments. 1956 to 1957. This year saw no major events. Now, in fairness to Sir Sidney, he was describing the LSE. But one is tempted to think about this, and Ralph Dahrendorf pushes one in this direction in this chapter of this book, to consider this more as a comment on the United Kingdom at the time. That in the late 1950s, early 1960s, one could just say, we're just moving along. Soon we will never have had it so good. But of course, in 1957, things were happening. All of you who are here for the conference on the European Union are at the edge of your seats. I know, raising your hands, you want to say, Treaty of Rome, Treaty of Rome. But I would like to start right? We all still remember the treaty, yes, we do, yes. But I want to start somewhere else, which is Malayan independence. 1957 was the year of Malayan independence. Coincidentally, Sir Sidney Kane had actually been the vice rector of the university in Malay. Now, why do I want to begin with this obscure connection? Because it seems to me that this is where we have to begin if we want to understand the muddle of European identity and the muddle of European narration now. One of the constant themes of the earlier panels and lectures and interventions has been empire. We must integrate the history of Europe with the history of empire. We must bring in the earlier history of liberal capitalism as one formulation. We must be able to think reflectively about Europe's role in the rest of the world. We must consider the first globalization and not just the second. I would like to put this in a much more straightforward way, as Andrew Hurrell and Margaret McMillan have already done, and simply use the word empire. It seems to me that the way to make the muddle of European self-narration make sense now is to speak sensibly about the continuing history of empire. Now, why am I going to insist on that? Let me now talk about narrative. What is a narrative? It is very easy to play with narratives, to which one is not actually personally attached. It is very easy to contest someone else's narrative, to see the holes in it, to understand how it's self-serving for them. It's very easy to look on, as we have been doing a bit in this conference, at a kaleidoscopic field of mutually contestable and contesting narratives, and to catalog and to analyze. But when does a narrative matter? A narrative matters when it's so deeply within you that you do not feel it. Or to apply a second test, a narrative matters when its existence is pointed out to you, it hurts. This process that we've been calling deconstruction is only real if it hurts. If it's not painful to realize that you have been inside a narrative, then it was not a meaningful narrative. Then we are just playing. So this is the kind of surgery which I would like to try to undertake now with Europe. Because what I'd like to suggest is that the reason why it's so hard to bring the history of empire back into the history of the European Union, or back into the history of Europe, the reason why we have these scattered calls all the time to bring in the rest of the world or to talk about the global south, that we aren't able to actually achieve this, is a narrative. And it's not the narrative of the bad guys that we don't like, or you don't like. Now, I'm not European. It is the narrative of the good guys. It is your narrative. Your narrative, the narrative of the good guys, the supporters of European Union, is an imperial narrative. This is the case that I want to make. And because it's an imperial narrative, it itself is what prevents you from getting your history straight. And I'm going to suggest that this has political consequences now for our time, which lead in fact directly into the problem of the digital world. So, grand claims. How am I going to make them? What's your narrative? Okay, let me define the second term. What do I mean by empire? That's another word which is easily tossed around. Let me throw out a few features. Colleagues can, of course, disagree, but let me just put these out for the purpose of argument. An empire is a political entity in which there is a center and there is a periphery. It's a political entity in which there is the rule of law, but law is applied unevenly. Some people are full subjects of it, some people are not. In practice, especially in war-making, empires are political entities that do not recognize other political entities as equal. So, for example, the United States did not recognize native nations as nations, or Germany in 1939 did not recognize Poland as a state, right? In that sense, an empire will tend to aim for autarky. That is, to imagine that an economic unit can be carved out over territory which will allow for self-sufficiency. An empire will tend to believe that technological superiority, which allows for conquest, is actually the result of racial or some other kind of superiority. And it will keep on believing that until the technological superiority no longer holds. The final thing that empires do, and they do it beautifully, and they do it well, is that they narrate. Empires narrate. They narrate better than nation states. They narrate better than Europe. They narrate fantastically well. Which is why, when we try to think of the great European literature, we very often run into literature which has to do with empire one way or another. Joseph Conrad would be an excellent example for me here, because here we have a British writer who is notionally writing about British Empire, but who is in fact a Polish writer, but not even exactly a Polish writer, because he comes from the part of Poland which is in fact Ukraine, and whose first experience of colonialism is actually Polish colonialism in Ukraine, which is why one can have a book about Ukraine by a Ukrainian author which is called Poland's Heart of Darkness, and have that make perfect sense, which in fact it does. The empires narrate, and I want to force those concepts together, because when we talk about empire here, we very often mean something dark and distant, and certainly not us because we negate it. But when we talk about narration, that's something friendly and playful and close. But I want to claim that empires narrate, and that they narrate better than we do, and that your best narrative, the one that's close to you and the one that's going to hurt, is an imperial narrative. Okay, what is that narrative? The European narrative, the one which is too close to critique, right, goes like this. The European narrative says there are nation states. These nation states are durable. They've existed for some very long time. And these nation states learn. They've learned over time. In particular, after the Second World War, these nation states learned that war was a very bad thing. And as a result, these nation states came together in a program of economic cooperation with the goal of leading to political cooperation, which would make war impossible. That, I believe, is the closest thing to a standard European narrative, as Europe is taught in history and as Europe is commemorated on practically every occasion. If you are European, you have heard this, perhaps pronounced less ironically, at least 10,000 times in your life. And to challenge it, as I'm going to do, I imagine is going to feel a little bit tense. One must challenge it. And here's why. It is balderdash. It is absolutely not true. And here, I'm not addressing narrative as narrative. I'm not going to say, that's your narrative, I have a different narrative. I'm now going to speak as a very conservative historian and say, this is simply baseless, conceptually and empirically. There is nothing to it. There aren't old European nation states. And the European powers that fought the Second World War, which were not nation states, by the way, did not learn from the Second World War that peace was good and war was bad. That never happened. If you have a European integration process, it had to come from somewhere else. Now, let me try to make the factual case here. So this narration, which I call the fable of the wise nation, the narrative that you carry inside you as Europeans is the fable of the wise nation, the nation that's old and that's increasingly wise. The fable of the wise nation begins from this axiom that there are European nation states. So let us ask, where and when were there European nation states, and what did that look like? This is interesting, because the place in time where there were, in fact, European nation states is the Balkans, that is to say, the crumbling borderlands of the Ottoman Empire in the first and second and third quarters of the 19th century. This is where the nation state is born, not just in Europe, but in the world, right? Not in France, which was never a nation state ever in the modern period, but in the Balkans. In the Balkans, we have, interestingly, the first decolonization, right? We categorize colonial histories beyond Europe, right? This is a mistake. This is a mistake that allows these narratives to go on. The first decolonization is Greece and Serbia, and then Romania, and later Bulgaria. That's the first decolonization. And these are the first nation states. These nation states, as all of you are historians of Europe will know, have certain inherent problems. One of their inherent problems is they don't have access to a large market. Leaving an empire means leaving a large market. Another of their problems is they don't have access to the sea. They handle this problem with a political economy of nationalism. The political economy of nationalism says, since our only tax base is land, the people who live in the land across this river are our people. And then you come up with other arguments that are linguistic or cultural or historical, as the case may be. This is the history of the Balkans in one sentence in the 19th century. A series of wars among militaristic countries that are nation states, technically, that are unsustainable. And their unsustainability arrives in a package which we know as the First World War, which is in fact the Third Balkan War. There's the first one of 1912, the second one of 1913. In the first one, the Balkan states defeat an empire. In the second one, the Balkan states fight among themselves. And in the third, the energy of one Balkan state, Serbia, is turned against the Habsburg monarchy. And then we have the event known as the First World War. So that is one part of the career of the European nation state. The second part of the career of the European nation state, I would venture to say, is even less glorious. After the First World War, the solution to a war, which was initiated by small nation states, turns out to be the creation of more small nation states, which are Austria, Czechoslovakia, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. So 6 states are created from former empires, more or less ex nihilo, and then a number of other states, Hungary, for example, are conformed in different boundaries. But the principled response to the First World War is more nation states. I'm not going to go into the reasons for and against this. Of course, there are historically intelligible reasons why this happened. But I'm just going to make the simple chronological technical point that these entities do not last for very long. All 6 of the newly created nation states, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, the 3 Baltic states, cease to exist completely by the middle of the Second World War. Their entire career as nation states lasts for about 2 decades. We heard the case of one of them, which is the Anschluss of Austria, last night. Right? That is one example of a general pattern. Austria has a story of Anschluss, the Czechs and Slovaks have the betrayal at Munich, the Poles and the Balts have the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. There's a national story, but the national story covers up the general truth, which is that all of the new nation states were destroyed. After the Second World War, the territory of all of these new nation states and the territory of the Balkan nation states, almost all of this territory then falls under Soviet domination, right? Which is not really a career as a nation state. So that's the history of the European nation state. That's it. I mean, with some small exceptions here and there, that's pretty much what you've got. Now you might be thinking, what about the great national unifications of the 19th century? Belgium. Belgium gets through one Leopold, but the second Leopold buys a stretch of real estate in the center of Africa, which you remember is the Belgian Congo, which is an integral part of Belgium for the central part of Belgian history. Italy, Germany are not founded as nation states. That's a retrospective projection by people who think that nation states are normal. They're founded as national monarchies, as kingdoms, as empires. The word Reich does have an operational meaning. The German state from the very beginning was imperial not just with respect to its Polish population, but very quickly with respect to its colonial territories in Africa and the Pacific. Italy also ventures as quickly as it can into Africa. These were not meant to be nation states, nor were they nation states. In the 1930s, under fascism, the imperial nature, or the imperial aspiration to autarky, is particularly clearly pronounced. Now, I have now told the history, briefly, I know, of all of the founding members of the European integration project. If you will just spot me Luxembourg, please. This is the history of all of the founding members and the history of the countries that joined in the first enlargement. Or to be very brief about it, Germany in the 1940s, right? If we think of the European integration project beginning in the 1950s, in the 1940s, Spain, Portugal, Germany, Italy, Britain, the Netherlands, these are all empires. They see themselves as empires, they see one another as empires. So into the 1940s, every single one of these entities is an empire. And so one begins to ask when that moment could have been, when the West European nation states realized that war was a bad thing and began the process of European integration. That moment didn't happen because it could not have happened, because these entities were never nation states. Let's attend then, very briefly, to the post-war years and the beginning of European integration. And let's begin with the most important case, which of course is Germany. The general case that I want to make is not that war is a good thing. I mean, lest I be misunderstood, and my American accent be taken the wrong way. The case that I want to make is that Europeans did not learn from the Second World War that war was a bad thing. Not in any straightforward way. There are a number of ways to make this case. One is to point out that the people who suffered the most from the Second World War were Jews, Belarusians, Ukrainians, and Russians. And however one wants to evaluate this, you wouldn't want to say that some kind of cult of peace prevails among the national memories of those countries, right? So that's one way to make the argument. I'm going to make the argument a different way, and that is the major participants are not learning from the Second World War. The major participants, West European, Central European, are losing colonial wars and exhausting themselves. That is what they have in common, crucially. That is what they have in common. To make this case, I have to begin with Germany, because Germany is the most important example. And as in so many things, Germany here is the leader. Germany is the leader in narrative production. Germany is the leader in a half-true at best account of itself during the Second World War, which by its nature not only shelters Germans, but shelters other Europeans. How do I mean this? The Second World War is, at its essence, in Europe at least, a colonial war. The war aims of Hitler are, above all, Ukraine and secondarily oil in the Caucasus. Hitler describes this absolutely clearly as a colonial war according to every classic definition. He interchangeably speaks of it as being like the conquest of America, the conquest of India, the conquest of Africa, but he's making it abundantly clear that he's thinking of a frontier empire. The way that Germany fights the war, that is, not recognizing Poland and the Soviet Union as states, and not recognizing what it's doing in legal terms as an occupation, and not recognizing the peoples of that zone as having the rights of occupied peoples, those are all mainstream, traditional European colonial practices. And by the way, Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon and Hannah Arendt and a number of people, I don't know why I pronounced Hannah Arendt's name with a French accent, they pointed this out at the time, right? African American and Afro-European intellectuals had a way of making this point that I'm making more or less at the time. This was a colonial war above all. And if it's understood as a colonial war, then one begins to see a larger pattern in the way that war is misremembered. So the Germans do remember the Second World War. I don't want to overstate this case. And Germans do, more than anyone else, have a culture of reflection about the Second World War. However, that culture of reflection is startlingly, I would say shockingly, anti-geographical. Insofar as Germans remember the Holocaust, they start with the camps, which is not where the Holocaust happened. They focus on the German Jews, most of whom survived, and who were 3% of the victims. When there's a secondary group of victims, it's the Russians, as though one could kill lots of Russians without killing more Ukrainians. Ukraine and Belarus are, of course, the territories after Jews, the places where people suffered the most. And by the way, the Holocaust, as it happened, is unthinkable in a number of ways without the colonial aspiration to control Eastern Europe. Because it is the colonial aspiration to control Eastern Europe which brings under German control the places where Jews actually live. So the canonized German minimization of the Holocaust, as well as the more or less complete blanking out of Ukraine as a colonial object during the Second World War, are not specifically German, however. This is the way it goes in general. The story of European reconciliation is a story which allows the colonization history to be ignored, right? So when Germany turns to France for post-war reconciliation, this is, among other things, a diversion. The Second World War, much as I appreciate Macron and Merkel meeting, the Second World War is not centrally about Germany and France. Germany was only concerned to get France out of the way so it could destroy the Soviet Union. The war was not centrally about France. For most of the Second World War, Vichy, which was a legally legitimate French state, was not in the way of German war plans. And more French citizens fought on the side of the Axis than fought on the other side, which is why there will never be, I realize historians should not predict, but this is why there will never be an official French history of the Second World War. Right? So in those conditions, treating Franco-German reconciliation as a kind of proper memorialization of the Second World War is a kind of diversion, and it's the first step towards the larger diversion, which is the fable of the wise nation. The Netherlands. The Netherlands. The Netherlands, of course, as you will all know, are a major European imperial power. They controlled Brazil until they lost it to the Portuguese, until the 9 Years' War, when they lost a great deal of territory to the French and the English. They were maybe or certainly one of the major maritime imperial powers. Into the 20th century, there are still several Dutch colonial territories, including most prominently the Dutch East Indies. During the Second World War, it was common sense in the Netherlands that the only way we could have a post-war recovery will be with the help of the Dutch East Indies. A starving Netherlands at the end of the Second World War took for granted that the Dutch East Indies would help the Netherlands recover. Immediately after the Second World War, the Netherlands begins fighting for the recovery of the Dutch East Indies. 140,000 Dutch troops, 140,000 Dutch troops fight from 1945 to 1949 in the Dutch East Indies. Now note, like Germany, this is not a nation state. There are no nation states here. This is not a country which has learned from the Second World War that one does not fight wars. It immediately fights a war after the Second World War. And it only leaves that war because it's losing and because the Americans won't help enough. That's the story. France. After the Second World War, France fights colonial wars more or less uninterrupted for 16 years. And it does not do so as a nation state. It does so as an empire. When France fights in Indochina, 3/4 of the mortal casualties that the French army takes are not French people. Right? It is fighting as an empire for for 16 years, more or less uninterrupted. First in Indonesia, as you will know, where those mortal casualties are about 75,000, very serious number, right? Although most of them not French. Then in Algeria. In the Algerian War between 1954 and 1962, it's very interesting to notice how, in French political rhetoric of the time, the word intégration is used. So it's actually quite striking if you're coming to it from today's point of view. Intégration, of course, means intégration européenne. Intégration means, at the beginning of the Algerian War, intégration means that the French army is responsible for integrating the Arab population into the French state. By 1961, the dominant meaning of intégration is that the French in Algeria will be integrated into the emerging Algerian state. But that's what intégration meant in the time and the place, as late as 1961. And as you will know the story, although I'm telling it in a slightly different way, it is empire which makes the republic difficult. Right? It's empire which brings that version of the French Republic to an end. It's empire is the problem which de Gaulle is meant to solve, and which he does in fact solve. But how does he solve it? Right? Is there a moment where de Gaulle magically says, now there is a French nation state? That moment never arrives. That moment simply never happens. De Gaulle recognizes that the French empire, he wouldn't use these words of course, is no longer sustainable, and he chooses Europe. The visit to the German officers in 1962, the Treaty of 1963, which Tony Judt calls the decisive turn to Europe, are also the decisive turn away from empire. There is no moment where there's a French nation state making a decision. There is a French empire which is choosing Europe as a substitute. That's probably the most important moment. Now, what does this choice of Europe mean for the Europeans involved? Well, let's think of another group of refugees. Let's think of the millions of Germans after the Second World War, the hundreds of thousands of Pieds Noirs, the tens of thousands of Dutch who are coming, for lack of a better word, back. What are they coming back to? Are they coming back to a nation state? In the case of the Germans who settle in West Germany, East Germany, and Austria, and a number of other countries, which one of those was the German nation state exactly? For the Pieds Noirs, who settled in Belgium and Switzerland and France, but also all over Europe. For the Dutch, many of whom incidentally are Jewish, are they really settling in a Dutch nation state? Is there a nation state that's greeting them there? Or as they return in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, are they perhaps, returning is also the wrong word for most of these people, are they in fact arriving in something which is not really a nation state, namely an emerging Europe? The interesting thing about the 1950s to 1970s, if one thinks about imperial history, and this is the part which is most shocking, most surprising, and therefore most taken for granted, right, is the economic recovery. That from 1950 to 1970 in Europe, average rates of growth were 4% a year, after previous decades when the average was 1%. That is the shocking thing. It's shocking at a whole number of levels, high levels. Like, if you fight a Second World War like this, should you really be recovering this quickly and this well? Right? But more profoundly, if you are losing the technological advantage to the rest of the world that was brought to you by the Industrial Revolution, which is what's happening, right? The thing which is enabling empire, the advantages of industrialization, is fading precisely in those 2 decades. How can that be the time when your growth spurts up? How can that be the time which is remembered as the glorious years, as the time when you never had it so good? How can that be? And the answer, of course, is Europe. And there are people who are looking upon this phenomenon and recognizing it for what it was. There were people who were looking upon what the Germans and the Dutch and French were doing and recognizing that this was how you go from empire precisely into something else. And those people were called the British political elite. So in the late 1950s and early 1960s, from the point of view of London, this story that I'm telling was then clear, right? Maybe not in every detail, maybe not the emphasis on Ukraine and so on, but the general outline that you need a place to go after empire, and that Europe was that place, that was generally seen. I would go so far as to say that was something like common sense. Of course, the British escape from empire was not as straightforwardly bloody categorical with an end date as it was with the Germans, the French, and the Dutch. The key moment might be 1956 as an imperial humiliation at Suez rather than Malay and Ghana in 1957 or even India in 1947. But the general lesson was, as we move from empire, we need a substitute. In 1961, the motion in the House of Commons, as I'm sure everyone will remember, to join the European Economic Community passed by a vote of 313 to 4. So the argument that I'm making more or less prevailed. Part of the problem in the 60s for Britain was that empire was still mixed into the question. There wasn't a categorical moment as there was for the Dutch or for the Germans and for the French, which meant that you could still debate Commonwealth versus Europe. And the British press was still loudly debating that, which helped de Gaulle as he prepared his arguments for the veto. By the end of the 1960s, it was harder to make that argument because the balance of trade was then clearly favoring the continent over the Commonwealth, which was the argument for applying again. Britain applies for a second time in 1967, and in one of these non-coincidences, which helps bring these, I think, 2 events that are one event together, it's in 1968 that Wilson brings back all of the British forces east of Suez, right? The moment of applying for the European Economic Community is the moment of conceding that the British Empire in its traditional form is over. It is the same moment. And at the time, I would say that was self-evident. The story in the rest of the enlarging countries, in this first enlargement, in the second enlargement, Portugal and Spain, is very similar, right? Portugal is a major European empire. By the 20th century, what remains is chiefly Africa. Portugal stays out of the Second World War, but Salazar, who governs all the way through, orients Portuguese ideology and the economy around Africa. African cotton is crucial to Portugal. When asked in 1968 how long Portuguese colonies would remain, he said it's a question of centuries. He later used the figure 500 years. Okay, you know that that's wrong, but what's interesting about how it's wrong, and at that time when he says this, in the late 60s, early 1970s, 80% of the Portuguese army is in Africa. Right? That's not a European, 80% of your army is on another continent. Maybe you're not a nation state. In 1974, what's striking about Portugal is the way that everything happened at the same time. If you're following the European integration narrative, you will notice that the people who come out of the Red Carnation Revolution are talking about Europe right away. Yes, they were. If you're following a democratization narrative, you'll notice that they were talking about democracy indeed. But they were also talking about decolonization. And what's interesting is that they were talking about all three things at the same time, and I believe correctly identifying them together. Because after all, you can't really have a democratic empire. And losing the empire was a condition of joining Europe. And Suarez was making these points in single sentences at the time in 1974. Spain, interestingly, follows the same pattern. Spain, the Spanish Empire has also been reduced to Africa, mostly North Africa, by the 20th century. The Spanish Civil War, which precedes the Second World War, is a colonial war in interesting ways. Franco is a colonial officer. He fights the war on the Spanish mainland according to what he himself characterizes as colonial methods. In large measure, it's fought by African troops, that is, not only Spanish troops who were veterans of African wars, but by Africans themselves on Spain, right? So Franco is himself a creature of empire, and he identifies Spain with the empire. It's another one of these coincidences that Spain loses its last claimed empire, the Spanish Sahara, within a few hours of Franco's death. And again, it's not a coincidence that the process of losing empire, the death of Franco, democratic transition, as we used to say, and the application to the European Union all happen at the same time. The application to the European community takes place 3 weeks after the first parliamentary elections, 3 parliamentary elections in Spain. Now, when I was at that first conference 25 years ago, Spain and Portugal were reference points for Eastern Europe. Spain and Portugal had joined the European, what was still then the European Community, just become the European Union. They had democratized after dictatorship. So these were comparands for Poland and Czechoslovakia and all the rest. But something else had happened by the end of the 1980s, early 1990s, and that is that this very West European fable of the wise nation had already crystallized. By then, each of these nations individually and all of them collectively had built up this story about how we as European nation states learned lessons from war in the middle of the century, and hence we have all joined together in this project. That story was already there by the time the East Europeans emerged from communism in 1989. And then the East Europeans came along, this is important, and rather than disrupting it, because why would they, affirmed it. Their story was, yes, of course, we are nation states recently liberated, and we would like to return to Europe, a very powerful saying at the time. Now, that whole notion that here we have more European nation states looking for a home is unchallenged because the fable of the wise nation has already won. The fact that these places had not really been successful nation states ever, or that when they had been nation states, that was the thing that tended to bring about those world wars which we were supposed to be solving, this isn't really noticed. What one might have done at the time is look under their reaffirming rhetoric, right? Because to some extent they were self-consciously affirming the West Europeans in their own illusions about the way history works. If you look under, if you scratch the surface and you look at their intentions, you see that, like everyone, at the moment when empire falls apart, there is an understanding of what the purpose of European integration actually is. Later we forget it, and the East Europeans here are no exception. But at that moment, when you say return to Europe, what you mean is, we know perfectly well from Munich and Munich and Yalta and Potsdam, we know perfectly well from 1956, we know perfectly well from 1981, we know perfectly well that we are not sustainable as nation states. Now that is not what you say out loud, but that is what the return to Europe actually meant. It meant that we know that we need a larger body in order to be states, right? Sławomir Sierakowski spoke yesterday about independence being the achievement of the European Union. That might have surprised some of you, but that is what is meant. It is precisely, people understood that at the time, and some polls still think this way, it is precisely the European Union which makes the state possible. Now, this is a story which in some way coincides with and overlaps with the idea of the European rescue of the nation state, which Andres Versching cited earlier, right? And I believe it is true that European integration saves the state, but there's a very important qualification here. It wasn't a nation state, because there were no nation states to rescue. You cannot rescue something that has never existed. And it wasn't exactly a rescue either, it was a transformation, because there was an imperial state. In all of these examples, there was an imperial state, and what the European project did was allow that imperial state to become something else. But there was no nation state to rescue, so that can't quite be the right way to formulate it. In Eastern Europe, what we have very interestingly is the second kind of integration. In the first kind, what you have are one sort of imperial fragment, the metropole, right? The bit around Lisbon, or the bit around London, the bit around Paris. These are the imperial metropoles of what were once much larger empires until very recently were still substantial empires. These are the metropoles. These are what remain after a certain kind of imperial disintegration. So up until the 1980s, what Europe does is it brings together the metropolitan fragments of empire. Its great success after 1989 was to join with the metropolitan fragments also the peripheral fragments. Because these nation states, these not particularly successful nation states, are all imperial fragments of the Habsburg or the Romanov, or to some extent the German empires. That is what they are. And the great and interesting success of the European Union in the early part of the 21st century is that it solves the problem not of the Second World War, but of the First World War. The First World War. It's not actually the peace. It's not the peace agreement after the Second World War. It's the peace agreement after the First World War. That's when these national questions arise. And it is in 2004, 2007, 2013 that these national questions are merged into the European Union, right? Okay, now, so the enlargements of 2004, 2007, 2013, you might think in the history of empire, at least in Europe, but not quite. Now, I've said before that when you are just about to join the European project, this argument that I'm making is fairly clear. Although you might make it in some other terms that are, a little bit kinder to yourself, this argument is fairly clear. Once you are inside the European Union, the spell of the fable of the wise nation is totally irresistible, and basically everybody goes for it. But when you are outside and you want to get in, the purpose of the European Union is absolutely clear. And this is the strange thing about the great misunderstanding between Ukrainians in 2013 precisely and many Europeans. Because the chief Ukrainian argument for joining the European Union, or for wanting to sign the association agreement, was, we are perfectly aware that our post-imperial state is deeply flawed. But we know that other post-imperial states became less flawed because of Yaki Communautaire and the integration process. I'm not making this up. This is what opinion polling of Ukrainians shows. This is what it was about. Meanwhile, in Europe, inside the European Union, because of the fable of the wise nation, this makes no sense. If you don't understand that your state was also, at one time, probably an untenable post-imperial fragment, you don't understand the point of view of another untenable post-imperial fragment. There's another group of people now in 2013 who understand this the way that I understand it, and that is the Russian elite. But they draw different conclusions. There are three historically possible answers for what to do after empire. And Europeans have supplied all three. There are three possible answers. One of them is the nation state, which I've already talked about. It has a short career. The second is European integration, which is the solution without a name, because we all know that it's happening, but as far as I know, it's very rarely referred to as what you do after empire. The third thing you can do after empire is, of course, more empire. And that is what Russia openly proposes in 2013. And here again, we have a major misunderstanding between, this time, Russians and Europeans. Because the idea that one would want to go back to empire, when empire has been totally displaced as a category of discourse and analysis, doesn't really make sense. Even though if you look at basic documents like the foreign policy concept of the Russian Federation, published in February 2013, it is absolutely clear that they have made a turn which is explicitly imperial in precisely the ways that I've described. There are now centers and peripheries, law no longer applies, there are other countries around us which are not fully fledged countries. This is clear not just in the rhetoric of Mr. Putin and Russian ideologists, it's stated Russian foreign policy in 2013. So the empire comes back in 2013 between Russia and Ukraine. And strikingly, it comes back as narrative. Among many other things, it comes back traditionally. It comes back as an argument about centers and peripheries, about who is central and who is peripheral. It comes back in the Russian argument that Ukraine is not really a state. Right? It comes back in the argument that one state can define the ethnicity of citizens in another state. These are all things that are very familiar. And it comes back as narration, as very powerful, I would say almost hypnotically powerful narration. And the reason why the narration was so hypnotically powerful was that there was something new about it, which was that it was targeted. So, and now we're moving closely to the subject of the digital world. When Russia tried to persuade you that invading Ukraine was a good idea that wasn't happening anyway, the way that they argued it for you depended upon who you were. If you were known to be on the British left, your social media in 2014 told you that Ukrainians were all fascists. If you were known to be on the British far right, it did not matter that these narratives contradicted, because in the digital world, we don't actually have personal contact. All that matters is that the narratives reach you and disarm you or disempower you the way that they are meant to do. But what's interesting about this is that narrative returns, this time self-consciously. So when I say that narrative is imperial, I'm not just making a playful claim. I believe this to be the case. I mean, it's imperial in an intellectual sense. The way that no matter what it is that you argue from whatever academic or other position, it can be described as your narrative, right? That's imperial. Right down to 2 + 2 is 4, which is where Orwell tries to draw the line. You can say, well, that 2 + 2 is 4 is just your narrative, right? I mean, I've got another narrative, and I've got a way of identifying with 2, which is, 2 feels like 2 is more than 2, and the other 2 feels like it's feeling a little bit down today, So the interesting thing is that this time narrative is self-conscious. So the Yale Russian Studies program, in its wisdom, during the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, invited the Russian ambassador to come to Yale and explain it, which he did. And his explanation, beautifully stayed clear of anything which might resemble a fact. And at the end of it, a Yale student raised his hand tentatively and asked, what about the Russian troops that are actually, right now on the sovereign territory of the Ukrainian state? And the answer was, you have your narrative, and I have my narrative. And there is that was literally what he said, right? And there was a self-consciousness about narrative here. And one way to think about this is that, in the famous story, which is probably not true the way all these famous stories are, but the famous story about the lady in Bertrand Russell when he says, she says it's turtles all the way down. It's narrative all the way down. It's narrative all the way down. Which brings me to where I want to close. What is the European Union, really? When we get away from your delusive and self-destructive fable of the wise nation, what is the European Union, really? What is it in fact?
And here I want to recall what Ralph Dahrendorf said at the end of that conference where I was working as a student. I want to recall the toast that he raised at dinner on the last day, which I only half understood at the time, but which still comes back to me regularly in different ways. He said, above all, I wish to see the end of clans. Clans, I thought, okay, clans. What does he mean? And then last night after dinner, I was talking to Daniel Judd and Ayam Suo, and Ayam Suo said, who has narratives? Public relations people and ethnographers. Okay? Narratives are about, not states. And this gets me thinking about where narrative might actually be leading us. Because an imperial narrative that goes all the way down, which has no other object but that to lead you astray from the institutions that you already have. European institutions are the most important example. May be leading us back to a place which is a lot like clan life. And what I want to propose here is that it is the fable of the wise nation that is making this possible. Okay, so what is the European nation? What is the European Union really? The European Union really is something fascinating and new. The case that I would make for the European Union is an Arendtian case. It is an example of natality. It's an example of people creating something new in the world. There has never been anything like this before. And it has, as a result, surprising origins and also surprising potentialities. And both the origins and the potentialities are overlooked when we stay within the familiar narrative. It's not a collection of nation states, because those nation states didn't exist. It's also not an empire, because the way that it treats its own constituent elements and its citizens has to do with an overemphasis on law and on equality. But what I want to say about this is that so I'm not just against a narrative, right? I'm against narrative here. If one does not understand it historically, if one sees it as narrative, if one doesn't understand it historically, then one is exposing it to weakness. In the creation of the European Union, understanding that empire was coming to an end was crucial. That is what made the European Union possible. Of course, you make good decisions for one reason and then you forget about them, right? But that's what made it possible. I want to submit that getting that history right now is probably just as existentially important. Because if one gets the history wrong, if one accepts the phantom of the nation state, I think where you end up going is chasing the phantom of the nation state right into the imperial abyss. Because the thing about the fable of the wise nation is that it creates a huge problem in domestic debates and therefore in domestic policy. Because the fable of the wise nation, the narrative of the good guys precisely, opens up a tremendous opportunity for the bad guys. I'm sorry, I don't mean that you're a bad guy. I mean that this is a reference to yesterday. It opens up an opportunity for those who wish to bring the European Union to an end, right? Because there is an axiomatic consensus about what the European Union is. The axiomatic consensus is that it is a group of nation states who, in their duration and wisdom, learned that war was bad, etc. Right? That is very convenient for people who like the European Union. It's all in quotes, the good guys and bad guys. I hope you get that. It's all very convenient for the good guys because you can say, we have learned, that's very pleasant. You can say, we're smarter than the Americans, right? That's the undertone. The Americans haven't learned that war was bad, and we learned that war was bad, right? And it's most convenient because it allows you to suppress and displace the history of empire. The history of the Treaty of Rome suppresses and displaces the history of Malay. In general, this whole story of European nation states learning and the fact that the action takes place on the continent of Europe allows everything else to just go away. It's your narrative, the narrative of the good guys, which allows the colonial history to vanish completely from the map. This creates a risk in domestic policy for the people who like European Union because the opponents of the European Union simply have to accept your terms of engagement. If you say the nation state was always there and it learned stuff from war, then the opponents of European Union can just say, Well, if the nation state is always there, what can possibly happen if we leave the European Union? And no one has a counter-argument for that, because they've accepted your terms of engagement. Whereas in reality, there is no particular historical reason to believe that any of the existing entities inside the European Union would survive recognizably as states if they left the European Union. It is, to put it mildly, an open question. And I think in the case of the existing United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the chances that it would survive as a state under that name for more than a couple of years are pretty slim. But it's a general point. Now, it opens up this problem in domestic discourse and policy, but it also opens up a huge vulnerability in foreign policy. And here I return to Russia. Because the way that digital foreign policy works is that it plays on pre-existing vulnerabilities. When Russia intervened in the American elections, these were things like fear of black people, fear of Muslims. When Russia intervenes in Brexit, which it did, and I await the British Mueller report with bated breath, when Russia intervenes in Brexit, or when it intervenes in Germany on behalf of AfD, which it does, or when it intervenes on behalf of the Front National in France, which it does, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Interestingly, the vulnerability that they play on is precisely the fable of the wise nation. One of the main lines of Russian digital propaganda is to say, well, yes, of course you always had a wonderful nation state. Putin himself even formulated this personally during the Brexit campaign, when he assured the British that all would be well and that Great Britain had always existed and none of its commitments were ever binding. Right? He went out of his way personally to affirm the fable of the wise nation. They are onto you. They see as vulnerability what you think is true. Right? They see as vulnerability what you think is true. And that's what a narrative is. A narrative is the thing that you don't see, which hurts when someone else goes for it, either by trying to explain it or by trying to exploit it. Now, the reason why this matters so deeply is this. The fable of the wise nation allows the whole category of empire to be put somewhere very far away. Right? So even in our efforts to say we have to bring back the global south or bring back global history or talk about the first globalization, empire as a thing is still very far away. Europeans contesting whether they should be in the European Union or not are not thinking empire. They're thinking nation state. And this is the trap. This is the trap. The idea that you're going to go back to a nation state is purely a result of the logic of the fable of the wise nation. Purely. It is a result of nothing else. It's not a result of the history of Europe, for sure. It's a result of the fable of the wise nation. The idea that there's a default category of nation state, and that all you have to do is peel away the artificial layers of European integration which lie on top of it, right? That's the fable of the wise nation. There never was a Britain, just like there never was a France or a Netherlands or a Germany. There never was a nation state on which this all accumulated. Instead, you had a post-imperial unit which became a European unit. And the difficulties that the British Parliament has with Brexit are, among other things, a reflection of this fundamental reality. The reason why it seems so strange is that the thing which is being talked about does not, in fact, exist, and has never, in fact, existed. Now, and why does this matter? Because it matters so deeply because out here in the rest of the world, right, out here in the non-EU world, empire never stopped. Never stopped. And empire is here waiting for you. And the people who are working so energetically are usually working on behalf directly, or often I should say, working directly or indirectly for one of these empires. Mine, the Russian one, the Chinese one, the various digital ones. Why is it exactly that digital technology is so prominent in the effort to break up the European Union? Could that possibly have something to do with the fact that the European Union is the only entity which seems able to do anything about digital human rights? Could that possibly be the case? Could there possibly be a connection there? Chinese, American, and Russian efforts to disrupt the European Union lean heavily on digital technology. And I'm stressing this not as a matter of technique, but because I want to close this lecture by trying to give a sense of what the empire out there is actually like. The empire out there is not just Chinese power and investors and Russian power and investors and American power and investors. The empire out there, against which the EU is an imperfect but the only known projection, is also a digital empire. It's an empire in which various kinds of entities, corporations, individuals, and states are using a technology which allows you to be seen in terms of your preferences or really your vulnerabilities. It's a technology which takes advantage of psychological practices, namely behaviorism, to categorize all of us into groups and then define the ways that we will most fruitfully react to stimulation. Frantz Fanon, who was a psychiatrist, as you will know, very much concerned with colonialism, writes in Black Skin, White Masks that the problem with his profession in colonial settings or imperial settings is the way that it allows humans to be transformed from why creatures into how creatures, which is one definition of what imperialism does. Some of us are why creatures, but the rest of us, the colonial objects, are how creatures. I can't go into this more deeply, but I want to suggest that what Fanon is saying about traditional imperialism also applies to the digital imperialism, which is out there and which is active. So my closing thought is that the way that the EU is historically interesting, that it is a soft landing after empire, is the same way that the EU has a future, that is as a buffer and a protection against the empires which are still there and which are forming up in different ways. In this sense, you can say that the EU is a phoenix, but my argument is that the phoenix, if it wants to revive, has to know the manner of its own passing.